What about politicians? How do they benefit from being in elite networks? One of my most controversial, or better yet, most revealing academic papers has been on how higher corruption of local mayors increases their chances of getting re-elected. How come, you might ask? Well, for one, corruption benefits politicians when it's an outcome of a clientelistic elite network, a type of relationship we talked about, from which politicians can extract rents while also staying in power because their group keeps them in power. In a codependent system based on close personal ties, where concessions are traded in return for votes, bribes, or any other kind of support, those linked with the politician, who have a lot to lose from their demise, will make sure they stay in office for as long as possible. In such an institutional framework, well-organized ruling elites will manipulate the economy by generating privileges based on what I call the personalization of governing institutions. So whenever interpersonal relationships between the powerful and the political elites determine both political and economic outcomes, societies will exhibit political capture of public institutions. The most accurate way to capture this type of corruption is to approximate it through potentially fraudulent procurement contracts administered by the local and national governments given to selected politically connected private firms. But hold on, yes, all this happens, but don't voters usually punish corruption? Surprisingly, no. Most empirical research suggests that voters often fail to punish corrupt politicians, even if the corruption was blatantly obvious. This happens frequently in countries like Greece or Italy, but also United States or even Japan. Perceived competence actually plays a very important role. Corruption becomes more salient to voters only if a politician is perceived to be incompetent. Incompetent ones, the ones building infrastructure, ensuring economic growth, handing out government benefits to a wide enough range of voters, they tend to be forgiven for corruption and any transgressions. Now put this in the context of elite networks. They're exactly what a group of authors, De Mesquita, Smith, Siverson, and Morrow, call a minimum winning coalition necessary to keep a politician in office. And what is that? A minimum winning coalition is a group of loyal supporters, like think of it big corporate donors or strong interest groups who lobby frequently, but also key individuals for a representative group of voters, like union leaders, religious leaders, or military leaders in autocracies, for example. All these supporters who directly benefit from having the politician in power and have an incentive to keep him there. Everyone loses if the central node of the network loses his position. In countries or cities or even counties where small powerful coalitions are enough to keep someone in power for very long, we tend to see personalized institutions, lower accountability, higher corruption, higher taxes, and yes, higher inequality, lower living standards, and lower incentives for economic growth. In dictatorships, this happens to the entire country, but in democracies, it's much more likely on a local level rather than a national level. Basically, it happens whenever political power is misused to promote partial interests. Here's what I've found empirically on the case of my country, Croatia, and its local government. Higher corruption will increase chances of being elected, but only up until a certain level. A little background before of how I got inspired to do this research in the first place. In Croatia, there was a mayor in the city of Zagreb who was in power for 20 years. He was arrested for corruption, bailed out after putting a €2 million bail, arrested again for intimidating witnesses, and 5 months later released thanks to the quickest ever constitutional court decision in his favor. He ran the city from jail for many proxies, and even managed to depose his deputy, a figurehead that was temporarily placed in charge, while in jail. You guessed it, after this he never lost another election. He was elected to parliament twice and won a new term as mayor just 2 years after being released from jail. Probably would have won another if he hadn't died just before that new election. And believe it or not, he wasn't the only mayor who did the same. He got out of jail on corruption charges only to get elected once again. Inspired by this and by many other stories arising from all parts of the political spectrum, from the right to the left to the center, I wanted to measure the extent of corruption by looking at potentially fraudulent, or I call them suspicious, public procurement contracts allocated by local mayors over a period of 8 years. The definition of suspicion was verified by direct interviews I've held with people involved in the procurement process, most useful of which were interviews I've done with special police investigators, specifically focused on corruption. So what is a suspicious allocation? Firms with 0 employees and that were single bidders on a tender but received procurement contracts worth millions. or firms where the signed contract vastly exceed their capabilities. So, for example, a contract worth 10 million going to a firm with revenues of 100,000 for the last 4 years, for example. And then firms also who had substantial losses and received subsidies for lucrative public deals. So, what did I uncover? Well, there is a positive causal relationship between corruption and re-election, but there is an upper limit. In other words, you will benefit from being corrupt, but only if you don't engage in too much corruption, where the size of suspicious procurements does not exceed 50% of all allocated procurements. So if you allocate around 20% procurements suspiciously, this will maximize your re-election chances. Go over 50% and you'll probably lose. Wait, so did I just provide a blueprint for stealing? Yeah, as if they needed me to tell them this, right? They knew it without me. I just looked at what the data showed. If you have a similar data set in your country, run the numbers. I'd love to see if this finding holds across countries. Fortunately, it probably does.